right, welcome back to another episode of Raise 'em Up here in season 4, and we're in chapter 8. So we feel like we're pretty far away into this book, Habits of the Household, Practicing the Story of God in Everyday Family Rhythms by Justin Whitmore Earley. And guys, I told Melanie this earlier, but for the first time in my life, I'm convinced that time travel might exist. Okay? Because I'm pretty sure, like, I go and get old, and then I go back in time and give Justin all of the words that he needed to be able to write this chapter, because this chapter spoke to like every piece of every passion I have and like every different thing. And it was just reinforced by the time it got to the fact that Justin makes bread. And I was like, this is so wild. And the truth that he just put down on this. Y'all listeners, this chapter 8 is all about play.
Yes.
Right? And I really did not think I could love this book more. And then here we are in chapter 8, and I'm obsessed with this book now. But I'm kind of laying all my cards out there on the table with that. Did y'all have a similar experience with this chapter?
I liked this chapter because, like, when I don't know, it made me think about when my kids were little, right? Because mine are 15 and 18 now. And but when they were little, and it just kind of justified all those nights sitting in bed reading books together. And my rule, we do not watch the movie until we've read the book.
Oh, nice. I like that.
And, you know, my kids will still bring that up sometimes. Wait, we can't watch that. Hadn't read the book. You're right. Let's read the book.
That's awesome.
Yeah, just that time together in play and having fun and with our imaginations. And yeah,
it was a refreshing take on how you can play and honor God, and how imagination is a gift from God that can be used to help kids understand like the absolute magnitude of God's love and his good story. I think sometimes when we think about imagination, we get tempted to think like, oh, well, if we walk down that road too far, we're going to cause our kids to like head off into some weird path or false reality. So it was very cool to hear this chapter speaking about the fact that, you know, when we're trying to think about our God and we're trying to look at his story, like there's so much in it that is beautiful and amazing and way too big to contain within comparison to like our day-to-day reality. And so the gift of imagination and the use of play to kind of unlock some of those pieces of his story, I just loved it. I thought it was really cool.
And a word I forgot to share with Justin when I went in my time travel machine and went back was just the creative side of imagination. And like, our God is creative, so it makes sense that we are too. Uma, what do you think of it?
There's a couple things. For me, I wrestled with this. And again, I always wrestle with some of the stuff because I'm coming from a different context, because I'm always going back to my own upbringing, you know, how this is connected. And so there are two things for me. Imagination rescued me. Okay, and I will dig into that a little bit more. Growing up in Liberia, growing up in poverty, growing up during the wartime, imagination is what kept you alive when the shells and the bombing and the bullets were flying around you and you had nothing to do except try to survive that day. What your brain protects you from, and I think it lends more into the second chapter conversations, but especially for me, I found that imagination from all of that protected and kept me alive. The word that I struggle with is play, because I think it's a privilege to have the opportunity to play. And not everyone, I think, experiences play as much in a healthy environment. And so for me, I think what I liked that Justin got into was, how can you remove yourself from the busyness of life and still engage, no matter what your socioeconomic backgrounds are, what your backgrounds. And so I found that to be helpful. But the word play itself was hard because it's counter to everything we do. We're so driven by, even our kids, we plug them into things that are supposed to be play, like sports and ballet and dance and all that stuff, but then becomes more of a competition and it's not the organic nature of play. And that's what I was wrestling. I was trying to balance between that and imagination. And so, yeah, it was a really good chapter, one that like I actually, underline it, which I don't usually do. My book is pretty plain, but I got to underline a few things, and just being lost in the imaginary world was huge for me. I would create stories in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And replace the sounds of gunfire with sounds of laughter, replace the violence that I was seeing around me with flowers. So for every blood trauma, every blood scene I saw, in my imagination, my brain protected me by showing me beauty of nature and stuff like that. And so I had so many stories that I wrote in my head
Mhm.
during that time. I didn't have paper, pencil, nothing to write because it's the middle of the war. But the imagination kept me going. And to this day, I find myself going to that headspace when I am troubled.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm struggling emotionally, I tend to go into my imagination space and I create a story.
Yeah. And I think I would add to it, right, since I helped Justin write this chapter, like future me did. Like ultimately I would say, yeah, that play word is something we have to unpack.
Yes.
And I think it's something that is scriptural. So I think that, like, again, helping Justin write this, like everyone gets to play. It's just we have to maybe not take the American understanding of what that
Yes,
word means in
exactly.
order to really embrace it. In the sense of we've got that word imagination that we've used a whole lot, which again, I'm just all the pieces that resonated with me on this, y'all, like the whole reading thing, huge. I'm definitely going to dive into the movie that he referenced from World War
my
II,
goodness,
because that was a
yeah.
piece of my history as well.
Yeah.
Life is Beautiful. Like I'm telling you, like I'm sitting here like I had to have helped him write this. Well, but then also this word delight, okay, which I'll borrow from Peter Scazzero's Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. That is a word that he uses when it comes to Sabbath, which comes in by the end of this, which again is just making me smile.
A whole nother-
The bread
yeah.
making, all of this stuff. And I think in order to understand that word play, folks, is basically the not work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's work and then there's not work. And so there's time when you're being productive and there's time when you're not. And then there's that idea of delight and joy and imagination and creativity and all these things that are wrapped up in this word play.
Yeah.
That's so important for development, sure, but all of us, because again, it's like, oh, okay, I'm glad I figured this out in the future to go share with Justin all these words, because like it's one of my own journeys with like Sabbath and what does it mean to actually play.
Yep.
And again, and when Peter Scazzero and he has a lot of books, but Emotionally Healthy Discipleship's the one I'd recommend to just the basic listener. When he brought in that word delight, when it came to Sabbath and rest, it changed my perspective of
Yes.
what play meant
Yeah.
and what downtime meant and what it means to find joy in life,
Yeah.
not just in the work that you do, but in the rest.
Yeah.
And there's so many things he said about all of those things that I just found delightful. So, yeah, I mean, we just talked about work. Now it's time for play. And again, he used that word play and pretend. Okay. And I there's another podcast I listened to, which is very few, but one called "Virtue in the Wasteland." It started, it ended, but one of the three big words that they bring out and what their whole purpose was and why they did that podcast. And the first thing was truth, goodness, and beauty. And I think that's the other word that comes to mind with a lot of what Justin is saying here,
Yeah.
is helping your children to find beauty
and
in
goodness.
life.
Yeah.
And it goes back to a lot of what you said.
Yep.
So I'll tap on that Life is Beautiful line because it's just a one pager in there. But he talks about this movie Life is Beautiful, which is basically a father and a son both get trapped in a concentration camp. They're going to die. I mean, it's a very depressing, it's a
Yes.
Holocaust movie. But the father this whole time in this death camp is helping the boy to laugh and have fun and play and do games. Like the dad is fully aware of everything that is happening. I mean, obviously, but
Yeah.
the boy's oblivious. And again, it's dark and it's sad because that's one of the darkest events of all of humanity. But there's also this life is beautiful. There's still beauty
Right.
even in that other side of it because of this journey of this
Love
dad
and relationship. and
pushing
yeah.
out the darkness.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of the language that Justin used too, is his parents a lot of times, again, not protect,
Right.
because they're still in the middle of it, right?
Yeah,
No matter
they
what
can't
it
change
is.
the circumstance.
And
yeah.
you can't keep them from that. But the invitation to navigate through that is so important for
And
you as a parent.
it's so biblical, right? It is God our Father who, I mean, if we want to take it even deeper, who is there with his son being the light, protecting us from the evilness that's around us. I mean,
Yeah.
the sacrifice of what Christ did on the cross is that glimpse we get here. And it's what we also, I like, you all often hear from Pastor Lee, he uses the words, the taste of what's to come.
Sure.
And that's what I feel like, when we can provide, or not necessarily provide, but if we can light that for our kids, our kiddos, give them that taste.
This is what Justin says,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, go ahead.
That's exactly what he says. And I think, to your point, this life is beautiful, this picture of a father protecting and guiding his son through this traumatic time. I mean, the best news is that our story is not a lie that we're telling our
No.
kids to get them through something until they meet their awful demise. What we are doing is providing the truth of what is to come, and we can help them to see that, to picture it, to experience tastes of it in the middle of the struggles that we're going through. We can help them to trust that, yes, this story has rough patches and dark spots, but it has a good ending. It has a good author, and some of those things that we place our hope and our trust in Jesus Christ.
And when
Yeah.
I used my time machine to go back and talk to Justin about this, I was sharing about how
Are you getting any
it's a
royalties from that?
No, not at all. All credit goes to him. Buy the book. It is all about getting, like where you kind of
Yeah.
started us. There's a taste of the kingdom
Yeah.
that's to come.
Yes.
An
Yeah.
imagination we have to use to understand God walking with Adam and Eve in the garden, and what we have to understand with what Revelation pictures for us of no more sin, no more death, no more all this other stuff. And there's this creativity to understand the fullness of who our God is, and the delight is that in him, and that delight that comes in the taste that comes from resting.
Rest,
right?
and
the
delight,
eternal rest that we're going to have.
Yeah, I kind of the first thing that I was like, oh my goodness, is when he says that in some ways he's talking about the movie, right? And then he brings it back to playing in the living room with our children, right? And that in some ways we are the guardians holding back the onslaught of all the world's darkness so that the living room can become a place of imagination and play. Play is thus a way to re-enchant a disenchanted world.
I love
I was
that.
like, oh
Re-enchant.
my goodness.
And can we talk about how this actually infiltrates our kids' spiritual lives? We don't have a great understanding in general of what heaven is meant to be. And so our kids also don't have a great picture of that. But through imagination and play, we can help to fill in some of that kind of outline of what heaven is with the delight and the joy that's actually there in scripture about what it's going to be. So for example, my daughter, she and I have been talking about death off and on. She'll have questions, and she asked about heaven one time, and we talked a lot about it. And then afterwards, she said, "Man, I thought we just kind of sat there, and I couldn't talk, and I couldn't move." And I said, "Well, what made you think of that?" And she said, "Well, my friend was telling me the story about somebody who, when they died, they just couldn't talk and they couldn't move, and that was it. That was the end of their life." And I was like, yeah, and it's so good to know that heaven's not like that. And that, we get to do things in heaven, and we're not just going to be sitting on a cloud singing to Jesus, but we get to have full relationships and be creative and, and have true joy. And she was like, that sounds awesome. I
Yeah.
want to go there. And I was like, me too. And so there's a practical bit of this that, sometimes we get disenchanted because we're just, when we think about death or we think about heaven, we don't delight or imagine what it's going to be like. Sometimes all we can do is just wish for the crappy stuff over on this side of heaven to end, you know?
Exactly. Well, and we can't think of what an unending day is like.
Yeah.
Where there is work and there's rest, right? Work that's pre-fall, right? That was
Yeah.
the result of the fall. Work just got
Fulfilling
harder.
work that,
Exactly. And a lot of times too, essentially that's what church is meant to be for us. And Justin gets into this at the very end, right? We shouldn't be so confined to time and in the moment. And what does this mean for us to be in community, to us to hear from our Creator?
Yeah.
Like see what He has to say, for us to find delight in what we get to share together in. And really every time we play, every time we delight, it's a taste of that same joy. And I appreciate the quote on the other page that Jan was reading. On page 165, He says, play then is a rebellion against the greatest lie.
Mhm.
I love,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love so much of these things. I'm like sitting there, like, please tell me I told Justin that line from the future, right? It's an act of war and allegiance to the greatest truth that Christ is risen and fairy tales really do come true, namely
Amen.
the one we're living in.
Yeah.
All right. And so it's just an awesome piece. And where the chapter goes from here, and you've heard listeners like a little bit of some of the advice that Justin gives to us, but he kind of breaks it down into 3 sections that are all delightful in their own way of habitually, right? Because that's the whole
Yeah.
purpose of the book.
Mhm.
Habits. Habitually read imaginative stories to them, habitually accept their invitations to play, and habitually send them out to play on their own. So let's talk about reading and how
Yay!
wonderful and great reading is. Was it not refreshing, the whole thing?
Oh my goodness. And I love to read. Like I have always loved to read. And when my girls were little, I was like, I want them to be readers. My
Mhm.
husband is not a reader. I'm convinced that he's probably dyslexic, was not diagnosed in school, and reading is a chore, it's
Oh,
a
sure,
job, it's
sure.
not fun, it's work. Whereas for me, I love getting taken off into other worlds. In fact, my girls are like, hey mom, look at me. Look at me. Because they know if I'm reading a book, I have heard nothing they have said. I mean, because I will get so engrossed in the books. So when my girls were little, we had books everywhere, right? I mean, they wore out the spines on the little kids' Bibles and just those kinds of things. But as they got older and were able to sit for longer periods of times, we read, novels together, The Lightning Thief and Harry Potter. And just, it was so much fun to just have that time together
Yeah.
to dive into imaginary worlds. And
I appreciate where Justin kind of starts it. There's this longing in all of us for another world.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I love that because
Yes.
it's think about it theologically, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course we do. We live in a fallen and a broken world, a world that's got sin, death, and Satan prowling around us all of the time. So of course we long for something different, something
Yeah.
of fantasy
Mhm.
and things like that. And I appreciate it where Justin took it and saying like, and with a lot of these stories, like we don't become obsessed with whether or not the stories that we read, right? Not scripture, but the stories
Yeah.
that we read, whether or not they're actual events, but whether or not they're true. And this took me back to my senior year of high school. Like I was blessed to, for 3 years of high school, have the same literature teacher, and she was awesome. And in my third year, I got a different teacher. He was awesome too. But my senior year, I had a teacher that put in front of me the book Things They Carried. It was a war book about Vietnam, and in there's a specific Tim O'Brien's the author. Like, and I learned to delight in reading. It was one of those because it was real stuff. I
Yeah.
really appreciate it. But in particular, in this book, they have the story of the baby buffalo, which I won't say in all of its fullness because of the graphic nature of it, for in case little listeners are listening along with their parents right now. But like, it's like these soldiers are not nice to this baby buffalo for whatever reason, because they're acting out their own trauma and things like that. But Tim O'Brien writes this in the book, and then he also is in real time talking about stories. And so people are like, well, was that story true?
Yeah.
Or was the story of the soldier jumping on the grenade true? Because it seems like a heroic story, but the truth of the matter is the story can go one of two ways. Either everybody's saved or everybody dies because it's a grenade, all this other stuff. And in that book, he gets to the whole truth of it. Doesn't matter if it's real, it's true. And what he's saying is what he's saying here, that longing for another world, that journey that you get in the book is bringing you some truth to the experience of life, whether or not the actual event is real, verbatim,
Okay.
and things like that. And
So a
it's-
deeper truth rather than the details of a reality.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so you're left with ambiguity after reading that book of what actually happened for all of this stuff. But in so many ways, this is what we do, right? As I was reading, I was going through, we must have in the future, what is actually the past when we were talking about making this book, we must have talked about the Bible Project and some of the videos there, because
Yeah.
in the Bible Project, it talks about how a whopping 43% of the Bible is narrative,
Yep.
because our brains are hardwired
Hardwired for
for
story.
narrative and story. And that's how we tell our own lives, right? The story of my life,
Yep.
right? You're not going to go and get every detail right. It's going to be crafted from your perception and these things like that. Again, I was diving into so many places I love to dive when it comes to this idea of story and why we have stories and the purpose of stories, but then ultimately that creativity and delight that comes from longing for something deeper.
So the quote that stuck out to me was on page 166. It says, the important fact when we're reading to our kids is that the stories we read echo the biblical story of sacrificial love, courage, overcoming evil and death as the ultimate enemy. So when we're choosing stories to read to our kids and things, stories that can have that ability to show our kids sacrificial love and, that good conquers in the end and that death is the ultimate enemy. And some of those themes can be really helpful for their hearts and minds. I mean, how many of us are longing for this point in this movie, and we watch it over and over again because we love the ending. We love how things work out. We're okay with the mess in the middle because we know how the story ends. And that's just good for our hearts and our souls. And it can be a great practice for our kids as well.
And that's that truth, right?
Yeah.
That comes out of the stories.
The
even
deeper
though it's
truth.
Not a real.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think to add to that, it also gives our kiddos an opportunity to understand that death is not final.
Right.
Because sometimes not all stories end with a happy ending
Right.
on earth. And there's that other ending we talked about. But I think the reality too is sometimes hard stuff happen
Mm-hmm.
and the story is left, I don't want to say unwritten because the second part is in heaven, but the part here on earth
Doesn't have a super happy ending.
Exactly.
Right.
and I think that's part of we want to always create that happy ending with our kids, but we have to be careful it's not a false happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
That there is implication of,
Yes.
of
Yeah.
that, right? That we have death, but death was won
Yeah.
by Christ.
Yeah.
So I think that's important too, especially as our kids start to ask those questions about death and stuff, because they are maybe encountering that in their lives with grandparents, great-grandparents, other folks, that we don't just minimize our imaginative stories and our fantasy stories to always having a happy ending.
Mm.
Because then you're going to give them a false sense of where to look for hope, because it's going to end up living happily ever after, and it doesn't always happen to be that way.
And that's true. I mean, especially, and I appreciate where Justin takes it in like reading stories, because
Right.
typically books do a good job of this. Like there is stuff like loss and things like that. A lot of times, sometimes movies, like especially when you become a teenager, all you do is watch romantic comedies and things like that. Yeah, that's not helpful.
Yeah.
But like I think of things like Harry Potter or Chronicles of Narnia or Lord of the Rings
Right.
or Divergent, or The Hunger Games. Like there's very real, solid stuff in there where you grieve and you have loss and you have
loss
to
Right.
deal with
suffering
struggle and
and-
it's not perfect.
Exactly.
And as cute as the bow might be, even at like something as epic as I'm a big fan of the Harry Potter
Oh,
series,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
it's still not pretty when you
No.
think about all of the loss that's happened along the
Yeah.
way and all the grief that they have to carry with them. And so it's just really, really important. And I appreciate how Justin points out that like practicing imagination, right? Forming that is just as important as giving exercise to the body and the mind, right? You've got to have this other piece. Otherwise, like no wonder like the mental health crisis that we're in. I mean, and as I've learned, like, I see the curious, what do you mean? Good
Yeah.
question. So I've also learned that most people don't read. So I've worked with students the last 6.5 years, very in particular, but certainly the last 18 years. And as I talk to students, most of them don't read. And
Yeah,
what do
not
they
for
do?
fun,
They're
not
just
for-
in the phone and
yeah.
they're just, I mean, and I get there is actual communication and connection in those things, but they have lost
Stories.
and with it meaning.
Mm.
They lose meaning. They lose purpose. They don't have lessons of how to wrestle with. They have TikToks that have 2 minutes of this little funny thing or this little jab. And so there's so many ways that I would get lost in books too. And I'm not the best reader. I love reading, but I'm not the best reader in the sense of like,
Yeah.
I should read more books than I do in a given year. But and I do make it a habit, like going on a plane flight.
Mhm.
It's similar to I'll listen to a podcast on a long drive. On a plane flight, I'm going to bring a book that's not work. I'm going to make sure I read a creative book that brings me out of that side of things because I find that practice important. And I love how then, right? And Justin deals with the early side of childhood and the late
Oh,
side
yeah.
of
Yeah.
childhood. And I love how he talks about reading aloud too. And he basically like never stopped reading aloud.
Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate even when I was older, like my middle school years,
Yep.
I remember teachers that read to me. I remember when I was a camp counselor, I would read. Like that was one of my things when I had on duty night, I would read a book to the cabin to get them to go to sleep, you know, and it would cut down on a lot of problems that could have happened. but I love that. And I do appreciate, Jane, you talked about how you read the book before you watch the movie, because I remember very vividly going just back to Harry Potter because that was my childhood. Like, and I think I've talked about this before. My 6th grade year, I had 4 book reports that I had to give for my 6th grade language arts class, and they were on the first 4 books of Harry Potter because that's all that was out. But that was the books, right? The movies hadn't really come out yet.
Yeah.
When the movies came out, though, I remember feeling so robbed
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
because of all that I had thought it was supposed to be. And that's where I learned why you read before, because your
yeah.
imagination goes.
Yep.
To
And you
all
have
those
these pictures of these
places.
people
Yeah.
and these people that you come to love and enjoy and you hurt with and you grow with,
Depth
or
and, yeah.
all these other things. And you remember certain details about them because the book
Mm-hmm.
gives it to you that the movie just can't give you. And I remember finally letting
that
go before the 4th movie came out, because it was my favorite book, the 4th one, other than 7. 7's great, but the 4th movie or book was so good, and I realized it was so long.
Yeah.
that there's no way they could give the fullness to
Sure.
what needed to be done. So, anyways, but just the practice of reading, and this idea, and I was thinking about it too. In a lot of ways, you think about music is the same, like that
Yeah.
creativity,
Yeah.
the imagination that comes to mind with really well written music. That same year that I did the things they carried, I remember having to play, or I could get bonus credit if I brought in a song that I thought was a ballad, because we were learning about ballads.
Oh, yeah.
And as I did so, I brought in 2 songs actually, because I was an overachiever. But I loved music too. And it was Brad Paisley's Whiskey Lullaby was one of them. And the other one was called Distant Shore by Dirk Bentley. So country music is what I listened to. Distant Shore was never on the radio, but both of them had such images and such story with them. And I remember getting called out by one of my classmates, like, do you actually listen to this? This is so depressing and blah, 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 blah. But for me,
Yeah.
as a senior in high school, it was helping me process
Yeah.
a lot of things in my own life and hurt and pain and all this other stuff. So just the practice
lyrics
of
Mm-hmm.
reading can be so helpful.
Yeah. And I think reading, so having taught like 2nd and 3rd grade, where kids really are, they're actually reading. Because I would tell my students, okay, you know what? 1st grade, kinder, 1st, 2nd, you're really learning how to say the words.
Yeah.
Right. 3rd
Yeah.
grade's that year where we are really learning how to read. And I explained it to him like, you know, guys, you've got to imagine that you've got this movie screen in your head and you're seeing
Seeing what's
these words
happening.
play out.
Yeah.
Because if all I'm doing is saying words, then I'm not getting it. It's kind of like, you know, when I read Harry Potter and I've got this movie going on and I've got these characters, the same thing happens when you read God's word, right? If all you're doing is saying the words and struggling so much with those words, you're not getting the
missing
full
it, yeah.
meaning of what God has planned for you. I think reading is one of those. So passionate about reading. Love to
Right.
read.
Well, I also think there's a side benefit even for your child's cognitive development. and
Oh,
Oh,
absolutely.
no doubt.
development.
Yes.
Yeah.
Read to your children. If you have not started reading to your kids, read to them, read with them, even when they're older. I mean, my
yeah.
kids were in middle school and we were still reading together
And
at
God's
night.
word says that we should do this.
Yes.
It says talk about this with your children
Yeah.
day and night as you walk, as you go. Like storytelling and being in the word.
Yes.
That's been part of God's plan for us because it builds community, because it builds imagination, because it gives us this truth. Another quote that I love from this chapter is, this is training for real life because often there's more truth in good fiction and poetry than in the news. And our hearts need that. And hearing good stories, what we're doing is exercising our imaginations because believing in the truest story takes a sanctified imagination. That is an imagination that has been set apart, that has been made holy, has been kind of renewed in Jesus. I just love that, you know, our imaginations are powerful and they can be influenced by good stories or by things that cause us to believe that, there isn't a good ending or there isn't anything out there.
For all our young listeners, essentially what we're saying is reading is play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reading is play.
Yeah.
Stories are play.
Stories. I was going to say, because like he even talks about how he told his kids about his imaginary pet dragon when he was a kid.
Yeah.
So even just telling stories of your life and your childhood,
Yep.
like even a book that I really found delightful recently was a guy that was around my dad's age that grew up in my dad's hometown, which again, every hometown is different than it was however like 60 years ago. Well, but like hearing this guy's stories, I felt like I understood my dad better. Like my dad didn't tell those stories, but like I was just relating to, I knew the places that he was talking about in this little short story book about his childhood. And it was just so much fun. And then I even read a second one by him that was like a creative, completely made up fictional one of the same thing. And I just felt a deeper connection to my own father who doesn't talk, right? So it was one of those like reading is so helpful. Telling stories, it's how we're hardwired.
Yeah.
And the idea of dreaming and playing and all of this other stuff. So that was one. Obviously, you found a nerd moment for us all. But then also this invitation to play, right? To actually participate.
Accept the invitation from your kids. Yeah.
Yeah. So when your kids come to play or want to play, do it. Now, I appreciate where he went it too. I was saying, like, especially if you're a stay-at-home parent, like, it doesn't mean you have to play with your kids all the time.
No.
It just means give in to the invitation for an intentional amount of time. And if you're one who is working more than 9 to 5 gig, like making the very deliberate time either before or after for play, it's going to be really, really important.
And lots of people might go, I don't play. What are you talking about? Are we talking about sitting on the floor with Barbies or like what?
Absolutely.
Like what kind of play? And honestly, anything goes. You know, and you're going to find that you're comfortable with certain types of play, and probably not exactly the same kinds of things as your kids. But the more opportunities you can say yes to different kinds of playing, the better it will be for you and your kid. So whether it's just an absolutely silly game or a mommy's exhausted, so can we find a game where I can sit on the couch? Yes, you can. It's called corners. You close your eyes, you count to 10, the kids pick a corner to hide in, and then you point to a corner and open your eyes. And if they're in that corner, you win. If they're not in that corner, you lose, and you do it again. And there's 100 different ways that you can find something to play with your kid where you're putting the phone down, engaging with them, and not working.
And focusing on them, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the things he was talking about was that engaging with our kids necessarily means that we do hard things like focus.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, especially for stay-at-home moms. I was a stay-at-home mom for 6 years. I mean, you've got your things that you are doing all day long, right? I've got to do this, got to do this, got to do this. But it's saying, okay, wait, no. That pile of laundry is not what I'm going to focus on right now. I'm going to focus on my kid right now. And we're just going to play. And maybe it does mean sitting and playing with Barbies. Maybe it means my kids loved Monster Tag. They would run, I would chase and say rawr, and it was Monster
Floor is
Tag.
lava. Yeah.
I mean, whatever it is.
And page 168 gives a lot of these things. Think about what it means to play with children. It means leaving this world and entering another one. It means becoming Lucy and stepping into the wardrobe only to find the back of it leads to another world. This is a world where dolls talk and Legos fly. This is a world where robbers are coming from the attic and broomsticks or horses to ride away on. Like imaginative reading, the capacity to get lost in play is practice for the kingdom for both parent and child.
And I like at the top of that page, it says we need these rhythms of play to interrupt all the serious stuff and remind us that the world doesn't depend on it.
Yes.
The world does not depend on all the tasks and the things that we feel like we have to do. But the world depends on our relationship with Jesus Christ and with his people.
Which is going to get all the way into the Sabbath at the end of the chapter too. I'm trying to see just this idea of developing whatever rhythm works for you. And so I appreciate it how toward the end of the chapter, he started peeling into what the next one is, which is going to be sending them out to play on their own. And he kind of alluded to sometimes like when in conversations is going to get into this too, but like sometimes when mom needed a break, he would go and play on like Saturdays was boys morning or whatever. Like, so that was a space, that he created, they created intentionally for we're going to play. It's like, I seriously, I'm like, okay, I'm reading this book. I'm ready for getting married. I'm ready for having kids. Let's go. Cause it sounds like such a fun journey. Like after reading through this, and the idea for him and Lauren of being so intentional, like almost having a notebook on their kids, keeping track of, did we play with so-and-so? Did we like on the back to the reading, like Lauren had a
reading chart
on the fridge, like the magnets. You think of chore magnets, work. What about a play magnet? Or, did we play? Did we read today? Did we read out loud today? Yeah. Like all these things. I think it's just such a fun approach to parenting.
Yes.
And to add to that too is understanding how each of you kiddos are individually wired.
Yes.
And so for play for me, with my 3 boys as an example, was different. With Ashwin and Arjun, it was always engaging, go outside, shoot hoops, play kick, throw frisbee, play soccer a bunch. For Avi, it was Pokemon and it was other things. And so I would engage. I would take him to Pokemon
Mm-hmm.
tournaments, not to play, but to watch him play with others,
Yes, yeah.
but be there and support him through that. And it took me a while because I'm like, this is not my thing. What am I
Sure,
doing
yeah.
here? It's a bunch of nerds. But now, then to see how the investment you do
Yes.
and that early age plays dividends, to see
Mhm.
my 22-year-old and my 16-year-old go bowling
Mm.
as a date, just the two of them. Or my 22-year-old, my 19-year-old play cribbage whenever they get back from work. and
Yeah,
just
brother
hang out.
time. There you
Well,
Right.
go.
And games
And
are a
in-
great way to do
games,
it. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, investing in each other. And so we've always been card games, Face 10, Skip-Bo, all that stuff, Scrabble, Pinochle. And the boys love that.
Yep.
And that's what they spend time with each other.
Yeah, play for sure at my house is no longer Monster Tag. Because if I said, let's play Monster Tag, they'd look at me like I was nuts. But play at my house now is, hey, every year they each get a new board game or card game. And so let's play a game. We sit and play a game. Or it's working a puzzle. Or it's, hey, you know what? You're into theater. Let's go watch a play together.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Good.
let's
I mean,
go
because
see
Justin
something.
gets into
Or
this
yeah.
too. As you get
Yes.
older, it changes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right, so-
Hobbies and yeah.
Yes, hobbies and joys and delighting. And again, like hiking, going out in creation,
Mhm.
seeing the beauty of that. Because I do think there is a push from Justin. Again, technology has its place, but there's separation from
Yeah.
technology in a lot of ways
Right.
in order to really use your mind the way
Right.
God designed it to be. And I just appreciated that so much about
Yeah.
the fullness of what he said. And when did he talk about bread making? Because I know it hit me.
It was right at the beginning of this section.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We have to
About
just mention
being-
this because it was like, okay, I'm just going to read the paragraph. Because I was like, this is where I was convinced. Okay. I helped him write this. He said, I have a friend named Steve, always asks me if I've been baking bread. I love baking bread, but I can do it only when my work is calm enough and life is in order for me to have a blank Saturday morning to pay attention to the slow rise of a loaf, or evening. I'm an evening guy. So it doesn't happen often, but that's why he asked. Baking bread is a sign that my life is in order. If it has been a month since I've done it, it probably is because I'm letting myself get too busy. So true. I think regular play with children is a similar sign that something in the household is going right. I loved that. When
Yeah.
you think about your own hobbies and your own way of delighting, because for me, baking bread came from a mentor of mine saying that was the way he Sabbathed, the way he rested. And it was a
Yeah.
delight and a creativity, all of it into one. So it was one of those things though, of just also you have to ask yourself, when was the last time you played with your kid? When was the last time you had an imagination with your kid? When was the last time you went on a walk with your kid? When was the last time you, all these different things, went to a play with your kid? Because that is going to be such a good measure for how things are going. The final piece, right, was, final piece of advice, and then it
Habit.
was in Sabbath, was to send them out to play on their own. And I thought this was so cool for the stay-at-home parent too, of just saying, look, you don't have to play with your kid all the time. In fact, that is probably not good,
Right.
because then your kids are going to become more dependent, and you're going to help them get comfortable with the routine thing of life, which is boredom. Yeah. And so like let them go out on their own. Let them figure it out. Let them learn to be by themselves, to sit still, to not be doing things all the time.
Yes.
Because it's going to be something that's going to help them grow emotionally
Yeah.
too. I mean, what else stood to you guys out about this habit?
I like that it said boredom is really the struggle against the fallen imagination.
Yeah.
So
I like
or
that.
boredom is like when you're disengaged and you're waiting for something to like fill the void instead of looking around at what God has given you and, like just having, again, that sense of delight or that sense of purpose and creativity. I love that. I thought that was really cool. But it says it's entirely possible to unconsciously indoctrinate our children into our broken view of the world, that life is fundamentally about what we can accomplish and there isn't time for anything else. And I thought that was a really good wake-up call, again, to the prior point that you made that, when's the last time you played with your kids? Because if you're not prioritizing downtime with your kids, you are teaching them that life is about go, 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 do, accomplish task, and that there isn't much time left over for them, for relationships, for God, for anything else. And that was a very good place, like almost like a thermometer check of, have we played? Have we spent time in God's word? Have we some of those things that can really indicate what our priorities are and what we're communicating about those to our kids?
And not just us and our busyness, but them,
Yeah.
right? Because we can tend to get our kids involved in so many things. You know, you've
Yep.
got to study, you've got this test, you've got this sport team, you've got this, you've
This
got
club,
this, and
this,
there's
yep.
no time to just sit and be bored a minute
Mhm.
and use your imagination and to engage in that kind of play. And it's easy. And I think it probably maybe an American thing, but I mean, when you're in the world of Facebook and everybody's posting all these
the stuff
things,
they're doing, yeah.
right, that their kid is doing, you have this innate, oh my goodness, I'm doing something wrong if my kid's not doing.
Or I don't know how to handle their boardom.
Right.
I don't feel equipped. Like I don't.
Or somehow,
I'm bored.
somehow boredom
and-
means you're not happy. Like or
Yeah.
something like that. It's like,
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
lie.
Yeah.
But like this idea, as both of you were talking, what was resonating in mine is work, sports, school, right? Which like I want Uma to speak into this because like Uma did something with our juniors and seniors this year.
I was just
That-
going to bring that up.
Yeah, it was just
Absolutely.
mind blowing to see because Wednesday nights transformed from a focus on junior high. And we'd already had everybody there, but we've kind of had more of a focus or worship. We'd done everything with Wednesday nights. And Uma said, you know what? I'm just going to start something for juniors and seniors to just be. And I was like, really? With all their schedules and all their other stuff, are they really going to show up when there's nothing structured and all this other stuff? And Uma, what's your experience been?
Well, I can tell you this. Even yesterday at a board meeting, one of the parents who's on the board said their child looks so much forward to being part of the yacht club
Wow.
and the opportunity to just come and be.
Mm.
There's no schedule, there's no expectations, which is hard when I have sometimes even adults come and be in that space. We got to do something. We
Yeah.
have to do
We're
something.
afraid of the
And
negative
I'm
space,
like, no, you're ruining it. Just let
Yeah.
it be. Just marinate in it. Maybe they'll go play basketball. Maybe they'll sit for 2 hours and talk. And when I mean talk, their phones are not there. They're looking each other in the eye and they're talking.
Wow.
And so the guys, they're throwing balls at each other. They're hitting each other. They're playing tag while the girls are trying to talk. But it's all done in a safe environment. And the biggest thing I found in that is just giving them a space for them to play
Yeah.
and feel safe and be themselves. And I think that is so important because a lot of them come from worlds where they're so busy.
Exactly.
Yep.
And it's almost like you come in whenever you want to.
Mm-hmm.
You can show up at 5, you can show up at 6, you can show up at 7. You leave whenever you want to. Hey, I have to go lift. Hey, I have to go help out with kids club or whatever.
Yeah.
There's no expectation other than you're there and
You're available.
You're available.
And imagine if you had that for your families.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like no plan. We're going to figure it out. We've just carved out space to just be.
And that
for-
doesn't mean just veg in front of the TV.
Yes.
Yes.
Right? We're
Or
just
turn on a
Yeah,
screen.
right.
That's the thing
Or
is there's
turn on
not
a
a
screen.
single,
Yeah,
there's
there's not a
not, there's no
screen.
TV, there's no movie playing,
Nothing.
there's none of this other stuff. It's just being together in
Yep.
conversation and having fun.
And they miss it when they're not there. Like
Yes.
I
Yeah.
have a child who I was like, really? Like she has volleyball practice on the night that yacht club happens. But what does she do after volleyball now? She doesn't come home. She goes to yacht club for whatever amount of time. And then they hang out in the parking lot for a little while longer
really
or
do,
go
yeah.
eat. But it's the relationships
Yes.
that
And
are being
honestly-
built and the true connections and downtime. She's not worrying about, volleyball. She's not worrying about college coming next year. She's not worrying about homework. Maybe she should a little more. But she's there with fellow believers in a safe place, just being.
And I just want to point back to something. I think we've talked about this in a previous season, but like in college, how all your relationships and all your people are there on campus with you and they live with you. And you have a cafeteria and you have your dorm rooms and you have all that, or, at least that's what it was for me. But these kids don't have all the same stuff. And as we recognized, after college, you have to work really hard for your relationships because you
Exactly.
don't have those common
Yeah.
spaces
Yeah.
and those common, routines and schedules and things. And so, can you imagine having the opportunity to just like walk down the hall and hang out with your best friend again like you did when you were in college?
Right.
How amazing would that be for your heart and your soul?
Mhm.
And then how can we carve out a similar space, a similar structure or schedule or just availability to have that downtime with the people that matter most to us, which
Yep.
is our kids, our families, our loved ones.
Exactly.
It's great.
And
is-
Yacht Club does start setting the foundation for that for our
Oh,
kids,
yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Because they're
Yeah.
learning, hey, this one night a week is set apart.
Right.
What a
Yep.
great habit
Yeah.
for them to get into as they're
And
growing.
the fruits of it has gone beyond just what happens on now Wednesday night. It's them starting Bible studies on
Yes.
Monday on their own. It's them going
Yes,
to
yeah.
rodeos together. It's them going to a baseball game
Supporting
to
each
support
other
They
at
eventually-
sports.
they
Yeah.
eventually
going
go
to a play, all
worship
that
together.
stuff.
I've seen
Yeah.
it. Like they go sit next to each
Yeah.
other and worship too. It's like it's incredible to watch. And as we think about all this too, like to wrap up that habit at least, page 170, I just appreciated the paragraph so much. One of the claims of this book is that Christian families cannot default to the American rule of life. We
Amen.
must fight for better habits. One of the places this is most urgent is helping our kids not engage in a life that is so busy that they don't have space for imaginative reading, long conversations with friends, silent reflection, hobbies that are just for fun, not for getting into college.
Yes.
A walk in nature, a road trip with friends, a church retreat, the list goes on.
Yes.
We know that we were created by God to work, but there is so much more to life than work. There's play and rest too.
Yes.
And this is what he takes us into this
Yeah.
about practicing the habit of Sabbath. And I was like, yes, like keep going.
This was my jam in this chapter. Loved it. As Sabbath is a whimsical rebellion against the idea that work is the only important thing in the world. It's similar to the language he used about imagination as
Yeah.
an act of rebellion, against the patterns of this world. I just loved it. Page 171. Sabbath is a practical habit with no end of theological significance. It's a firm reminder that the real work of the world has been finished in Jesus' death on the
Yes.
cross. And we have much that God calls us to do, but we don't have anything to prove. Oh, what a relief that is.
and I
That
appreciate the end of
just-
that
yeah.
end of that paragraph. We can rest because God has done his good work.
Yep.
Right. Ultimately, the world is not dependent on us.
Yeah.
I love this. Right. And I only had, that was one of my notes for this. I had three notes on this. This was it.
And 3
But-
stars right there.
Yeah, exactly. Whenever I talk about Sabbath and my need to do it better, I always remind people of what my experience is when I come back from vacation. It's so nervous. Like tomorrow I'm getting on a plane, right? And I'm gone for 5 days? That's a long time, friends. That's a really long time. Gone for 5 days. And in my brain, right, what my American habits that I picked up says is, oh, way to go, boss. You're gonna have so much work to do. Everything's gonna fall apart, all this other stuff. And every time I get back, I'm laughing.
'Cause it was
Every
fine.
time. The world didn't end. Crazy. The work didn't get done. That's when I look at some of these students and it's like, oh, I've got to get this done, this done, this done, this done. And you kind of ask that question of, well, what happens if it doesn't get done?
Yeah.
Is the world going to keep spinning? Is it going to keep going? Are you still going to have a hope and a future? Oh, okay. Right? Then that means you're allowed to pause and stop. You don't have to go
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed this. And much like Pastor Lee and his bread making, I have a passion for cooking curry.
That's right.
I love cooking curry. And to me, that's my Sabbath. And when Justin talks about, when you're not having time, for me, it's creating that time, making sure every other Saturday or at least once, every third Saturday, I am dedicating my evening for cooking and inviting. And it goes to his second pillar in page 172, where it talks about the second pillar of Sabbath for us is communal gathering. And for me, that is the joy to see your kiddos there, the Almonds, a couple of kiddos, Chloe, and just hearing laughter in my home. It's been years because my kids don't run around, don't chase each other with stuffed animals anymore. But it is what I grew up in. I grew up in a multi-generation home. I grew up with laughter, and I grew up around the meal. And so for me, it's not just me cooking. It's my boys. Avi went through 5 different stores to look for a curry leaf because we couldn't find it in our normal Indian store. But just the engagement of the boys help in the cooking. The boys do different things. Tony's involved. But then just sitting and watching my friends
Exactly.
enjoy the meal and having conversations and just opening our home. I think that's part of that. And our boys being able to give up their space
Yeah.
to share with others and teach them the world doesn't revolve around them. And so for me, this hit home.
And
big time.
for the listener that hasn't read it just yet, right? The 2 pieces of Sabbath that Justin points out are that worship and community. Those two things.
Twin
is
pillars.
the twin pillars. And he talks about how in the afternoons on a Sunday, he'll have his extended family over, or they'll engage with extended family in some ways of this. For those that are like me, you don't have extended family over here. This is why it's so important to create those spaces, to find those extended friendships and what that means, and to develop those. Because like I can tell you, and I don't think my small group will be surprised at me saying this if they're listening to this, but like I found it over the years, something inside of me struggles to host my small group every time. But then when the invitation comes up for me to let it go to another house, I'm like, no, yes, it's good. I'm good. Because I'm fighting it. I'm like, oh, but I've got to do this, this, and this. My house isn't ready. Oh, that means I'm going to have to clean this and blah, blah, blah. And of course, my small group does not care. They tell me all the time, I don't care if your grass isn't mowed. I don't care if you didn't get to mop. I don't care all this other stuff, right? Because these are all things that keep us from being in community. So I'm wanting our listeners to hear this.
Yeah.
Every single time. And I'm also going, oh, great. I'm still having that pastor hat on, leading a small group, all this other stuff. But every single time, I don't regret it. I don't regret laughter being in my house. I don't regret I got to throw my first party in January. Like it was an epiphany party, of course. Like, but I don't regret it because it was community. It was stopping.
Yeah.
And it was like where Justin began this section. He said, there's something playful about the command to rest.
Yeah.
Right? There's something playful and fun when we actually give in to being in community, stopping. And there's something deeply God honoring about it when you actually experience it. To set aside the time to say, ha, 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 you think I have to work all the time.
Exactly.
Let me show you who my God is. And ultimately it's up to his work. And I'm saying this as a self-confessed workaholic. So like, I just, again, so much to delight in this chapter. As I thought about that too, it kind of closes with this idea of implicit memory and rhythms of play. I thought that was so helpful. And basically to summarize it, and again, I think in the future, I'll pursue some sort of more education and counseling. So the fact that it brings up child psychology, I was like, I'm telling you, there's a time travel thing that happens. Finally convinced of it. But the idea behind it is simply this, that you have explicit memories, which is when you remember something so clearly that you could talk about what happened, like a trauma that happened when you step into a room or something. But then there's implicit memories that you gather because you're not necessarily remembering specific words or events or things like that, but you're remembering
rhythms.
Feelings and what was the word?
Rhythms
that happened. And so the invitation, which is a favorite word of mine lately of Justin's, is for you to give your children implicit memories of play and joy and delight and imagination by practicing these habits with your own kids. And I just thought that was such a great way to end this chapter.
Yeah. And so they have the habits of play, and then he kind of gives you like the synopsis and some books.
Yeah, great
and things.
resources at the very end.
But I loved his main idea here. I don't normally, I'm like, yeah, okay, that was it. But it says, getting lost in fun and imaginative play is an echo of the kingdom to come, a sign of the world that is full of joy. Practicing good habits of play is a way of cultivating a more Christian imagination that foreshadows the kingdom to come. All of these things that he's saying, do with your family.
Yeah.
I mean, we think, okay, yeah, this is just for fun, but it's not. It's reminding our kids and reminding ourselves, hey, there is something way better to come.
It's training, exercise. It's not a waste of time.
Yeah.
And again, I want to circle back a little bit where Uma started us with the "In the Life is Beautiful" thing. At the end of the day, again, hopefully none of our listeners' lives are going to get that level of trauma, but there is still trauma and sadness and darkness and struggle in this world for every single one of us. And so this invitation to play and Sabbath and rest is exactly what you were just talking about, Jayanne, of bringing that light into the darkness of the world, pushing it back, being that guardian of what dictates our lives and what doesn't dictate our lives and things like that. So y'all buy the book. I don't have any royalties because I didn't actually travel in a time machine.
You're not a time traveler.
I'm not, yeah. But there's so many good resources, extra things in here. Enjoy the conversation for yourself. I'm just so thankful you're listening along with us.
Yep.
So I won't make the rule you have to read the book before you listen to the podcast, but certainly read the book before you watch those movies. Just a great little habit. Hey, in the meantime, join the conversation with us, whether that's sending us an email, raiseemup@trinitycline.org, or finding us on Facebook, Raise 'em Up podcast. Make sure you use the word podcast when you find us on Facebook. But at the end of the day, I'm just so excited to think about all the different conversations people can have as a result of either reading this book, if that's the only thing they do, or listening to this podcast and going and talking with someone else about how fantastic this advice is, how much you need it, generating ideas with each other. Maybe you share this episode with a friend or something like that. Happy to hear about those things too. At the end of the day, though, we're all here for you as you continue to raise up the next generation of believers, ultimately, of kids that are going to continue to live out the faith that they've got. And these habits in this book's going to help you. Next time, we'll see you for chapter 9 as we learn about the habit of conversation. We'll see you then.